Welcome to the Sugar Creek Baptist Church video podcast for July 21st, 2006.
Are all religions valid expressions of God? Does it really matter what we believe as long as we're sincere? I mean, don't all religions get us to the same destination anyway? Many people today fully accept the idea that the answer to these questions are yes. Then Vice President Al Gore, in 1993 at the President's Prayer Breakfast in Washington, D.C., made this statement: "Faith in God, reliance upon a higher power by whatever name, is, in my view, essential." What the Vice President was articulating is what many people in this country have come to believe. That is, as long as you're sincere, then whatever religious belief that you have is fine. Whatever religion, it makes really no difference, because as long as it's a higher power that you look to, whatever the name is of this higher power is perfectly fine. Really, I can understand how a person would arrive at that position, because the truth is, in our culture, this really feels right. It feels good. We have a culture that has really adopted the idea of total tolerance, at least about morals and religion. And by the word tolerance, we really mean anything that just seems a little bit right should be fully received as an equal expression of truth. And so it makes sense that when we're talking about religious things in this culture, in this day, it's the only generation that has arrived at this kind of position before, but in this generation of relativism, the idea feels good to say all religions are equal expressions of God, valid expressions of God. He's shown Himself in different ways to different people, but all of them have been originated by God, and as long as you're sincere, that's all that really matters. And honestly, doesn't that feel good? I mean, to hear that, it takes the pressure off, and it's so tolerant. The only problem is that it can't be true. It's not possible for it to be correct. It's sort of like religious drugs. They feel good, it seems right at the time, but it's a mirage. Now, I really don't mean to be rude. Please, I really don't mean to be rude. But I want to tell you that a person who arrives at a position that says all religions are valid expressions of God, that person is only showing their ignorance about the details of what each one of these religions teach. That they simply don't understand those religions and simply have not taken the time to understand how in the world can you put these things together. Because the real problem is this: all the major world religions have major, distinct contradictions. I'm not talking about differences. I'm talking about contradictions. And the scientific law of contradiction says that two things that are opposites, that are directly opposed to each other, cannot be equally true at the very same time. But yet we try to put religion into a contradiction of the law of contradiction. There are thousands of contradictions, not just differences, that these religions have. Let me just point out a couple of them. First, the gods of each of these religions are contradictions. In Hinduism, there are millions of gods. There's a cloud god and a rock god and a river god, and there are just millions of gods. They don't mind other religions because, hey, the more gods, the merrier. And in fact, as long as you are built in a certain caste system, in the caste within their system, you could, if things worked out for you just right, evolve into one of those gods. In Hinduism, there are millions of gods. In Buddhism, there is no God. The whole concept of Buddhism was built upon atheism. It was originated 500 years before Christ by a man named Siddhartha Gautama. He had been a Hindu, but there was a point in time in which he just didn't buy the millions of gods. And so he made a decision he'd go the other extreme. There are no gods. But there is sort of a cosmic consciousness that is in existence. And so the goal then became, how do I reach nirvana? Now, I hear the word nirvana used today as an equivalency to heaven, but that's silly. That has no equivalency whatsoever to the concept of heaven. Nirvana is the personal extension. It is the absorption of a person into this cosmic consciousness, so that personally they don't exist anymore. It is the goal of Buddhism because the individuality of an individual causes them to constantly be reincarnated. And so in order to stop that, you've got to be absorbed into this consciousness and cease to exist as an individual. That's the goal of Buddhism. In Hinduism, there's millions of gods. In Buddhism, there's no God. In Islam, the God is called Allah. I've heard many people today say that Allah is simply a general name of God that is talking about a true God, the true God. But that isn't the case at all. Allah was one of the many gods of the Arab tribes, and in fact, He was the favorite of Muhammad's father. Allah was the moon god. That's why in Islam today you have the crescent moon symbol that's sort of the same idea as the cross in Christianity, because it's the symbol of what Allah was. He was the moon god. When Muhammad created Islam, he selected his father's favorite god to become the God of Islam. History shows that Muhammad changed the description of the pre-Islam Allah to be more like the God of the Bible. The reason is because there was a great sense of influence of Jewish and Christian travelers who went through Mecca, and Muhammad was very aware of many of the Bible stories. And that's why when you read the Quran, you see some of the Bible stories that have been inserted in the Quran, because he simply took them from his past experiences with Jewish people and Christian people and inserted them into the text of the Quran. Muhammad's version of Allah was different from the moon god. His version of Allah was very similar to the God of the Bible, but he made some changes. His version of Allah is as a distinct, distant, unknowable God. He is not a father. He does not have a son. The whole idea in Islam of there being a son who comes to the earth and dies for the sins of the world and rises again is considered heresy in Islam. In Christianity and Judaism, the God of the Bible is Yahweh. There's two ways to say that name. There's Yahweh, there's Jehovah, but in the Hebrew, they are equivalent. God expresses love and grace toward those who do not even believe in Him. He is holy, and He requires judgment, and that time of judgment is coming. In Christianity, God declares that He is a Father and He has a Son. He is a personal God who wants to know us and wants us to know Him. His Son took on a body, came to the earth, lived a perfect life, died on the cross, rose again, and offers to us the opportunity of salvation. There is nothing remotely similar to these major religions in the nature of God. In Christianity, He is a personal God, but in Hinduism, there's millions of them. In Buddhism, there is none of them. In Buddhism, by the way, an emergence after Jesus Christ was they saw the importance of a Savior, and so there was, over that next 100 years after Christ became known in Buddhism, the emergence of Hinayana, then Mahayana Buddhism, that took on saviors that are called bodhisattvas, who then took on the role of Jesus for them. And they worship those bodhisattvas, but the truth is there is no God. People believe that Buddha is a God and they worship Him. No, He is simply a symbol of the idealism of the understanding of Buddhism. There's no God in Buddhism. There's millions of gods in Hinduism. There is a distant God in Islam. If a person says that one God has simply revealed Himself differently to different people in different places, they're really saying that God is schizophrenic and that He is a liar. He doesn't know whether He exists or He doesn't exist. He doesn't know whether He has a son or He doesn't have a son. He doesn't know whether He is personal or impersonal. I want you to think with me for a moment about this illustration. Suppose someone came to you and said, I met Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise has long black curly hair and purple skin. His whole skin is purple. Somebody said, no, wait a minute, I've met Tom Cruise. He has very short, straight, blonde hair and red skin. And third person standing there says, I've met Tom Cruise. I know him personally, and I can here to say to you, he has no hair and no skin. Somebody's not telling the truth. He cannot be all of those things at the same time. The law of non-contradiction demands it. Yet that is what those who say all religions are just different expressions of the same God are trying to lay on God. God is a real person. He has distinct characteristics. He's revealed those characteristics. He cannot be all of that at the same time. There's another example. The way of salvation of each of these religions is total contradictions. Buddhism teaches that to be saved means to be absorbed into a cosmic consciousness and cease to exist as a person. Nirvana. The Hindus believe that if you follow the rules of their holy books closely enough, you can evolve into becoming a god. If not, you will experience unending reincarnation. In the Muslim religion, salvation comes from being good enough for God to let you into paradise. You never know until you die and you face Him whether you've been good enough. Jesus, on the other hand, is declared to be God in flesh. He was without sin. He is the only way of salvation. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. In Acts 4, verse 12, it says, salvation is found in no one else. For there is no other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. Salvation does not come in our own ability to save ourselves. It comes by faith in Christ alone that is demonstrated in commitment. It is a decision to acknowledge our sin, to turn from our sin and turn our heart to Jesus Christ and to trust Him alone for our salvation. That's how salvation comes. Jesus and the Bible doesn't really give us the option to say we can believe in Christ and at the same time believe that all other religions are valid expressions of God. Jesus said, no, you cannot believe that. I'm the only way of salvation. Now, here is the truth. Either Jesus Christ is the only way of salvation or He is no way to salvation. The intellectual C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, you either believe that Jesus is a liar, or you believe He's a lunatic, or you believe He's the Lord. It cannot just be, I believe He was a good teacher. He couldn't have been a good teacher because a good teacher would not say, I am God and I'm the only way to heaven, unless he was telling the truth. And so if it's not true, we ought to close up shop and go home. You've got to decide, is Jesus crazy? Is He a deceiver? Or is He deity? Is He God, as He said He is? Think with me for a moment. Logically, it's not logical for Jesus Christ to be only one pathway. Here is God the Father who sends His Son, who goes through all of the beating, the scourging, and the crucifixion that He endured to purchase a place in heaven for us, a way of salvation. But as soon as that has happened, you can go down the street and you can get to heaven some other way through some other God. My question is, what kind of a father would put his son through that when there are so many other ways to get to that God? Why would God do that to His Son when it was not necessary for us to be saved? Logically, it makes no sense. The law of non-contradiction says that positions that are diametrically different from one another cannot be equally true. All religions are the same is a feel-good fantasy for people who live in this culture and this time of relativity in this country. All of reality is made up of exact laws. And doesn't it make sense the God who made this reality made it to demonstrate Himself and His own nature? He is not so contradictory that you cannot know Him. Rather, He has revealed Himself so that you could. I think to myself about going to a doctor's office. Got problems, I need to see a doctor, I need him to help me, and so he runs all these tests. He gets back all the data from the tests. But when he walks in to see me, he says, you know, Mark, I'm really not a hard-headed kind of guy. I'm not narrow-minded. Really, I know what it is that I think is wrong with you, but it's not really what I think, it's what you think. It's how you feel. I don't want to invalidate your feeling. You tell me what you want. Heart transplant, kidney operation, toenail removed, what is it? You tell me. I want to be open, I'm tolerant. I'll tell you, I'm up and out of there in a New York second. I want to go to a real doctor looks at the real tests, says this is what's really wrong with you. Can you imagine getting on an airplane? You're there, ready to taxi. Pilot comes on, says, I know, you thought we were going to Paris. I know. But look, I'm not a narrow-minded pilot. I'm not just set in my ways. I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm just going to punch some buttons. Wherever we go, wherever the plane takes us, that's all that matters. Because the truth is, all ways lead to the same destination eventually. Get me off the plane. I want to go to Paris. See how nutty this world would be? So tolerant, but crazy. But yet this is exactly how people want to paint God. There is a God. He has definite characteristics, and He can be known. How do I know who God is? Dr. Hugh Ross is an astrophysicist. He was raised in an agnostic home. He had not had a meaningful conversation with a Christian about Jesus Christ until he was 27 years of age. But as a young man, still not encountering any Christians, he encountered a course on world religions, and it got him curious. This is a brilliant young guy, became a very acknowledged astrophysicist. And he began to have questions in his own mind. Well, are any of these religions true? And if they are, how could I know? And so he came up with this idea. It sounds like a scientist, doesn't it? He said, if there is a God, seems like all these religions have holy books, and if there is a God, then it seems as if I read their holy book, if that holy book really comes from this God, that holy book will be scientifically accurate. That sounds like a scientist, doesn't it? He said, it seems to me that if there really is a God, He would know what scientific laws are. He would know what scientific proofs that we have discovered are. And so I'm going to read each one of these books with the idea that I'm going to go through each one to see, are there scientific flaws that a God should know were wrong? This is what he did. He began in his own testimony to go through each one of these religious books. He went through the writings in Hindu and Buddhism and Islam. And he said, honestly, it didn't take long because he said, I kept encountering stuff like, well, there are people that live on the backside of the moon. There are people that live on the sun. He said there were just so many things that just when you read it, you say, oh, come on now. If this was a God, surely He would know that there's nobody that lives on the backside of the moon, nobody that lives on the sun, no people. So he discounted those rather quickly. He said he kept the Bible at the end because it represented, at least the Old Testament, two different religions, Judaism and Christianity, and because the Bible was just so big. And he said he began to go through the Bible, and he had two pads. One pad was all the scientific truths that are articulated in the Bible, and clear, distinct scientific mistakes that are articulated in the Bible. And he said he took these two pads, and for 2 years, this young man, not attached to Christianity, not trying to prove Christianity, he was really trying to disprove it. For 2 years, he went through the Bible. And he said when he got to the end of the 2 years, the pad with all the scientific things that he had discovered, he said he was shocked. He started articulating some of the scientific truths that he found in the Bible that were not known until the last 100 years or so, and he said he was shocked by them. But he said the pad that had scientific fallacies was empty. And some of you are thinking right now, well, wait a minute, what about Genesis chapter 1? This is a scientist. In his testimony, he said the deciding factor that after 2 years that caused him to accept Jesus Christ as Savior, the trigger was Genesis chapter 1. Now, you say, I'm really curious. I'm glad, because here's what I want to do. We got permission from Hugh Ross himself to duplicate his testimony. 1,000 copies on CD, 500 copies on cassette for people who don't have CD players. And we're going to give one of these copies free to every single family that has come today. Now, you can't take 2 for your family. If you do, there's going to be other families that don't get them. You have to take 1. They're going to be in the foyer. Don't leave yet. I'm not finished preaching. But they're going to be in the foyer. There's 4 tables. You can go there. You can just take 1. We want you to take 1, but not more than 1. I'm going to challenge you to get your family together, and I want to challenge you this afternoon to listen to this CD, this cassette. It will blow your mind. I want you to hear what he has to say. The end result was, on the basis of what he had scientifically discovered from the Bible, he chose to become a believer in Jesus Christ. And one of the greatest things that caused him to move in that direction was this whole issue of Bible prophecy. I'm not talking about the second coming of Christ. I'm talking about prophetic statements that were in the Bible about places and individuals, and specifically also about Jesus Christ. Fulfilled prophecy is the greatest single evidence for the validity of the Bible. The Bible has all kinds of evidences, and in fact, next Sunday morning, as we continue this series on evidences or difficult questions, I'm going to zero in on this whole issue of how do I know that the Bible is true? And I'm going to tell you, you better be here next Sunday. I'm going to go through some very specific issues that will deal with this whole apologetic issue of how do I know the Bible is true? And you need to be here next Sunday. There are all kinds of issues that we're going to be dealing with. But I've got to tell you, head and shoulders over them all is this whole issue of fulfilled prophecy. I want you to think about it for just a moment. No one knows what's coming tomorrow. We can guess, we can suppose, but we don't know. Much less a decade from now, hundreds of years from now, thousands of years from now, we don't know. The only way someone could know distinct, detailed kinds of prophecies is if God told them. In fact, in many places in the Bible, God has said that He uses fulfilled prophecy as a way to distinguish Him from the other so-called gods. Isaiah 48 verse 3, time and again I warned you about what was going to happen in the future. Then suddenly I took action and all my predictions came true. That's why I told you ahead of time what I was going to do. That way, you could never say, my idols did it, my wooden image, my metal god commanded it to happen. In other words, God gave prophecy to demonstrate that He is the true God. Now, totally accurate prediction of the future is the domain of the Bible exclusively, and one of the great proofs of its validity. There are thousands of very detailed prophecies in the Bible that have already come to pass. That is exclusive of all the other world religions. There are no prophecies in Hindu writings, no prophecies in Buddhist writings. In original Quran, there were no prophecies. Not until they encountered this issue were half a dozen to a dozen prophecies inserted. They are so general, it's like in 900 years a dog will cross a stream. It's so general. How can it keep from happening? But in the Bible, there are so many distinct prophecies. Just the prophecies concerning the first coming of Jesus Christ. He'd be born in Bethlehem. He will be born of the lineage of David. These events will happen during His lifetime. He will be crucified. And a description of the crucifixion before it became even a form of execution in Psalm 23. Even the year that Jesus is to walk into Jerusalem or come into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey as king, found in a prophecy in the book of Daniel. Very distinct prophecies. No other religion has that. Mathematicians have calculated the probability of these things coming true in one person and basically threw up their hands and said, it's not possible. There are three representative fulfilled prophecies from the Bible that I want to bring to your attention. One is the prophecy about a city of Tyre made by Ezekiel in 580 BC. There was a man named Ezekiel who lived in 580. There was a city named Tyre that was a thriving seaport during the time of Ezekiel. Through God, Ezekiel prophesies that a number of things are going to happen to this seaport that could not have just been surmised. He prophesies that King Nebuchadnezzar II, a Babylonian king, will overthrow the city. It happened. It was a 13-year siege. Ezekiel further prophesies that later that city will be totally destroyed, made as flat as a rock, and that fishermen will spread their nets over that city, and it will never again ever be rebuilt. Pretty definite description of those prophetic utterances. Well, hundreds of years after Ezekiel, Alexander the Great laid siege to the city. The inhabitants of that city fled to an island that is just off of the coast. The problem was Alexander couldn't invade it with a naval fleet. So he came up with this concoction. They would destroy the city of Tyre. They would throw all of the stones of the houses, of the buildings, of everything into the sea to create a causeway so that his soldiers could walk across the causeway to that island. It was that close. That is exactly what they did, and they ended up defeating the people that had fled to that island. The city was totally destroyed. It was made as flat as a rock because those rocks were put into the sea. It has never been rebuilt again. The only thing that lives in that area of Tyre are fishermen who throw their nets over the rocks that have been thrown into the sea to create a causeway to dry out the nets. Some would say, well, no, wait a minute. People came along after these things happened, rewrote Ezekiel to make it look like Ezekiel said these things hundreds of years earlier. But the problem is that scientists who are linguists and archaeologists all verify that the writings of Ezekiel took place 500 BC. And how could they tell? Because language changes with time. People do not talk today like people in America talked 200 years ago. Good grief, people in America don't even talk like people from New York today. I mean, we don't talk the same. There is an evolution of language. I so apologize for all of you from New York. I'm just teasing you. People don't talk the same. Language evolves. Yet Ezekiel's writings matches the language of 500 BC, and the specific events he details have been now verified archaeologically, proving that his book was written in that time period. So the question is, how did he know hundreds of years before what Alexander the Great would end up doing to the city of Tyre? Unless God told him. The book of Daniel prophesies that 4 great kingdoms will emerge after him and gives specific details about each one. Daniel chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 8 foretells 4 great kingdoms. The Babylonian Empire, the Median Persian Empire, the Grecian, and the Roman. Well, the Babylonian and Median Persian happened during Daniel's life, so it makes sense he would know that. But the Grecian and the Roman empires did not happen for hundreds of years. So how could he know? He didn't just say two other great empires are going to come. He described them to a detail. People say, well, what happened is that people came along later and they bridged into Daniel's writings, and now they gave the detail once they saw these nations appear. However, linguists and archaeologists have verified that this book had to have been written hundreds of years before Christ. And then when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the 1940s, there were books that are dated back to 200 BC. Before the emergence of the details, some of the details that Daniel described. And the book of Daniel is one of those books that were discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls that were dated back to 200 BC. How did he know, other than God telling him? A king called Cyrus is predicted 120 years before he is born. Josiah, 300 years. Bethlehem, 700 years. The Media, Persian, Greek, and Roman empires up to 500 years. How did they know? Here's the third, the return of the Jews to Israel. On May 14, 1948, a miraculous event took place. Never before in history has a nation ceased to exist for 1900 years and the language been dead, ever been revived. It's never happened before. But several prophets foretold that the Jewish nation would be destroyed after a series of events, and that did take place in the first century, 70 AD. And those same prophets said that after it is destroyed, that the Jewish people will be scattered all over the world, but they will retain their Jewish heritage. And supernaturally, they will be brought back together to give birth to a new nation, and even their language will be restored. Ezekiel, Isaiah, these two men spoke a great deal about this prophecy. So that on May 14th, 1948, when David Ben-Gurion announced the rebirth of Israel, he used the prophecies in the book of Ezekiel and Isaiah as his authority, and he declared what these two prophets had said thousands of years before has now come to pass. How did Isaiah and Ezekiel know unless God told them? 3 examples, but there's thousands of them. Detailed prophecies. One of the great evidences of the validity of the Bible is fulfilled prophecy. Since the Bible is true, what does it say about Jesus Christ? What does it say about salvation? Jesus said in John 17:3, "Now this is eternal life, that they might know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you've sent." Jesus said, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." There aren't any other gods. There aren't millions of gods. There is a God. And His name is Yahweh. He is a Father who has a Son. And He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, to come to this earth, to take on a body, to live a perfect life, to die on the cross, to pay the penalty for our sin, to rise again from the grave. And Jesus said, "For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believed in Him would not perish, but have everlasting life." That invitation is to you and it's to me. And He has given evidence that He is indeed who He is through many undeniable proofs. Fulfilled prophecy, only one. But He has said to us, "Here I am. Receive me."